one of the first things that God did when he gave instructions to Moses was this: make me a sanctuary. The Hebrew word here is mikdash, which literally means holy, holy thing, holy object, holy place, and we will see the implications of this, that I may live among you. There was just one primary purpose for the sanctuary, and that is a dwelling place for God. One of the most common questions we ask ourselves is, or we ask somebody that we meet, where do you live? And the Israelites, who had been in Egypt for so long and had gotten used to the pagan idolatry worship of Egypt, probably question in their mind, so if we don't have images of this God, if we can't see him with our eyes or hear him with our ears, so how do we know where he lives, or even if he is real? And so God realized that the Israelites, with their background, needed a living demonstration to realize that he was with them, that he was among them, that his presence would impact everything about their lives. Just as a preview for ultimate conclusions, sanctuary and sanctuary language and the sanctuary services occupy such a huge chunk of biblical narrative material as well as thought. Now, if that was not important, then why would so much of the Bible pertain to this one particular subject? And yet I must confess that this is the least understood subject among Christians. The first model we have, of course, is the tabernacle of Moses. This is the first complete model of a dwelling place, a holy place of God. The second model is Solomon's temple. And this model itself went through at least 3 different phases: Solomon's temple, Ezra's temple, and then, of course, Herod's temple. But one that is virtually unknown, and that is Ezekiel's futuristic temple. Now, here is a temple that occupied a big chunk of Ezekiel that was never fulfilled. And yet the resemblances to some other material elsewhere in the Bible is extremely intriguing. Moses' tabernacle occupies nearly half of the book of Exodus, and then chunks of Numbers and obviously Leviticus. So everything from chapter 25 to chapter 40 of Exodus is about the tabernacle, but the material is divided into 2 parts. From 25 until the first half of 36, we have the instructions from God. Do this, make this, the table, the ark, the curtains, the wall planks, and so on. And then in the second half of that, chapter 36 until the end, we have the description of what was built, plus the inauguration of the temple. Christians like to use the word dedication. It doesn't really matter. When the temple went into function. Now, here was the interesting thing about this whole picture. As long as they were in the instruction and building phase, everybody was at work, especially the Levites, the priests, and some designated people. There were 2 engineers that we are told whom God specially gifted just for this work, an amazing piece of information. But once the inauguration was complete, the sanctuary became sacrosanct, and we will see that meant no one could enter the tent proper. So if this was the dwelling place of God, and yet most people could not even go inside, what was the point of the whole thing? And so we will have to keep some of those thoughts as we move along. In verse 8, God says, make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. In verse 9, he says, make according to the pattern that you must build this sanctuary. Interestingly, a different word is used for sanctuary, mishkan, which literally means home, but we'll come back to that a bit later. What's important here is that God seems to be very particular about how this should look. Well, at least that's our view of it. And most people who study the sanctuary get caught up in what pattern means. They think this is about the physical structure, we will see that there's a lot more to this. But let's dissect that idea of pattern. What did God mean when he told Moses, build according to the pattern I have showed you? The Hebrew word here is tabnith, but tabnith is quite broad in meaning. Literally, it can mean a copy of something. And so like what China did, they look at a BMW car and they made a copy of it with just a slight change of the logo and claim it's not a BMW. But in all reality, it really is just a copy. And based on this understanding, a lot of people believe there is actually a tabernacle, a sanctuary, a temple in heaven. But the fact that we have multiple models on earth should make us cautious about that conclusion. It can also mean an architect's drawing, or what we would call in today's world blueprints. I don't know if you've ever had your own house built or ever built your own house. All modern buildings, the first people are the architects. They design, they draw it out these days on computers, 3D dimensions of computers. And then the constructors take those blueprints and build accordingly. A third possibility is this, a scale model. For example, I have a Ark of the Covenant with me, but this is not the real thing. It's just a scale model of the real thing. It looks as close to the real thing as we can make it, what we think it might have looked like. And I hope you can see it in my hand, even though it's relatively small. I actually have a full model of the sanctuary, 3D model. I had to assemble the pieces, took me a long time. It's quite intricate. That is a scale model, 1/90th of the original. But when you put it all together, you can see the picture. Okay, this is what it means. My personal take on tabnith, it's not the first one. It's probably a combination of blueprint and scale model. So if you say there is a sanctuary in heaven, yes, there's a model of it. I don't know how Malaysia does it, but in Thailand, when they are ready to sell a new condominium building or a new housing estate, what they do is they build models of those apartments or the condo buildings, and they have these on display in some mall. And people walk by and they see, that looks nice. I think this will be good. And so you are actually buying based on the model, but the model is not the reality. I think we're all familiar with that concept now in our world. So in Exodus 25, 8 and 9, we have two names for sanctuary or tabernacle, whichever word you're comfortable with at this stage. The first name is Mikdash, which simply means a holy thing or a holy place. And we shall see why it's called a holy place. The second name is Mishkan. This would become the more common name from this point onwards. Mishkan literally means home. Or if you're a little bit more particular, to translate the word literally, a dwelling place. In the case of the tabernacle of Moses, it also means the tent, because that tabernacle was basically a huge giant tent. And so we have two different terms used in the Torah. So be careful when you're reading your Bible, whether it's called holy place or Mishkan or Mikdash, both of them are referring to the same structure. Now, what does this tell us from these two names? Well, Mikdash is built on the Hebrew word for holy. Mishkan is built on the Hebrew verb for to live. And so a living place that is holy. And that kind of clues us as to why maybe certain sections of this dwelling place of God may be off limits. Many years ago, I was doing a week of prayer at the Bangkok Adventist Hospital. And so in the evenings, after the meetings are over, the pastor who was there at the time, a friend of mine, we decided to go for a walk every evening. Not far from the Bangkok Adventist Hospital is the main royal palace called Shilada Palace. Now you can walk all around. You cannot really see inside. There are high walls with electrocution fences at the top, and guards at every entrance. So I kind of jokingly said to my friend, I said, let's try and go in. Remember, it's already nighttime. Maybe we'll sneak in through one of the gates or try and climb over one of the lower walls. He's a Thai pastor, and he said to me, he said, Dr. Fanwar, if we do that, the moment you land on the other side of the wall, you'll probably get shot. And if you don't die, you'll end up in jail the rest of your life. Now, in royalty or monarchies of the world, we have that distinction of spaces. Does that also apply to the tabernacle? Is that why it's called holy, but also home, a holy home? Now, that's an intriguing concept. And so keep that in mind as we move along through these sessions. If you go to southern Israel today, there is a life-size museum called the Timnah Tabernacle. It's out there in the desert. It simulates the conditions of the original tabernacle. It is full size, except that it's actually air conditioned inside. I don't know how they did the air conditioning inside, but you can go and visit. It's not cheap to go to Timnah Tabernacle. You have to spend a whole day on the strip. But if anybody is planning to go to Israel, hopefully you touch bases with Timnah Tabernacle. That'll give you more of a actual size 3D view. Here's the setting of the Timnah Tabernacle. It's a little bit like the original tabernacle of Moses, out in the desert, dry, barren land. That's where God built his first home. Now, the distinctive thing about all the models is this. They all have a three-part structure. This is a cross-section of Moses' tabernacle, and it too had a three-part structure. And there are three entry points. The first one is here, second one is here, and the third one is here. But these are not just entry points, they also mark the spaces, because there is a varying degree of holiness. It's holy space, but less holy. It's holy space, but it's a lot holier. It is holy space, and it's absolutely holy. The first space from curtain number 1 to curtain number 2 is what we know of as outer court. Now, in Adventist jargon, they often refer to this as the courtyard because that's how the King James Bible referred to this place. The Hebrew simply means a court as in an open space, a bit of an enclosed space. Notice the fencing all around. The second, which we call the holy place, is usually simply referred to as the holy. Now, because this is space, and so in English we attach the word place to it, so it makes better sense. The third space, which is between the back wall and the final curtain, in Hebrew is called the Holy of Holies. That's probably the best way to translate, because we're not sure of the exact implication of the name. It seems to indicate a hyper sense of holiness. Think of it like holiness in the highest degree or the nth degree. Now, again, in the old Bibles, this was called the most holy place, but that nomenclature fails to capture the intricacy of the Hebrew phraseology. So court, holy, holy of holies. Now, notice that holies is in plural in Hebrew, which means that this is not the only holy place. All places around God's home is holy. And that's why it's the Holy of Holies, which means while they're all holy, this is absolute holy. And so the old name, most holy place. There are two items in the courtyard, the altar of burnt offering. If you can see, this is a 190 scale model. Okay, it's a big structure. It's about 2 meters by 2 meters and nearly 2 meters in height. This is not some little altar. Think of the number of sacrifices that would have been offered every single day in Israel or throughout the year. it was a fairly monumental structure. More importantly, this altar of burnt offering, or sometimes simply referred to as the altar, is the most active furniture in the tabernacle. Activities on this altar were 24/7. Everything else had time limitations, but not this one. And Israel were taught that even the fire that was on this altar must never go out, even during their journeys. You know, when I was a kid, they taught us the sanctuary and gave us the idea that the Israelites were wandering the desert for 40 years over and over and over. Today, most scholars will agree that the Israelites probably moved very little. And one of the reasons is the sanctuary. This thing is so complex. It is so large. Even this altar is so big that it doesn't make sense to move. And each time they move, they'd have to find a space big enough to encompass not just the tabernacle, but also the camps, all the tents of Israel. And so there's a very good chance that they moved only 2 or 3 times in those 40 years. They basically stayed put. Something else about moving these furniture, whenever they moved, everything had to be in precise order. You know, I had a colleague of mine who realized that I'm very careful about how things are done, the order, placement of things, and, you know, with my life, timings of food, and etc., etc. And so she said to me one day, she says, "You have OCD." I don't know how many of you in my audience have OCD. I think you know what that means. Now, I feel perfectly fine OCD, because if I have OCD, it's because God has OCD. Everything had to be so precise that you could not shift the order one way or the other when you move. Otherwise, the people who handled it would die in the process. Now, that is real OCD. The one piece of furniture that we have no idea what it looked like is the basin. Think of it more like a water tank, because this was the only supply of water in this tabernacle. But think of what that means. They were in the desert. They were there for 40 years. Water was in limited supply. If you had a water tank that is open like this picture here or this picture here, how long would the water last? How long would they, or how often would they have to refill? Personally, I believe that the water tank is more like this, probably with a cover on top and faucets or taps along the side so that they can control the amount of water evaporation. Now remember that God had performed miracles in the desert to bring water to Israel from a rock, from the sand. And so they would have had very limited water supply, and they cannot use the saline water of the sea, even though they might have access to that. And again, another reason why they would have stayed closest or closer to those oases that are found in the desert. This was a fairly active place, but only for the priests. They had to wash themselves, hands and feet, before they entered the sanctuary. They also had to do other kinds of washing, like washing the parts of the animal. In the first chamber, the holy place, we have a table. Now, most of you probably know this as the table of showbread. That was a mistranslation of the King James, because the Hebrew says the bread of presence. The first thing that told Israel that God was with them. And if you reduce it to size, 1/90th, like this model I have, it would be this big. It's a pretty small little table. It's about 1.5 meters long and about 0.5 meter wide and about 1.5 meters tall. That's about the size of most office tables these days, or maybe a little bit smaller. What was important is food on the table. Most people think only of the 12 pita bread, the 12 chapatis there. They're not bread in the modern sense, but there were also wine and water and drink, because this was the main food on Sabbath for the officiating priest. This bread changed only once a week. And that change was done on Sabbath, but you could not carry the bread outside, so the priest had to eat inside, and he would need liquid in order to eat the bread. So there was wine or grape juice, if you like, whatever, and there was water. Again, where did they get wine in the desert? There are a lot of mysterious elements which scholars have not been able to explain. How did this bread, which was unleavened, in other words, no yeast, no rising, no preservative, how did it last for a whole week and not spoil? How did they get wine into the sanctuary? Where did they find the grapes? Did they have to purchase wine from somewhere? There is as much what we don't know about the sanctuary as what we do know. You've seen already two things here. We don't know about the basin, how it looks, how large it was, and how did they keep the water from evaporating. And now about this table, the bread on it. The more familiar item is the menorah. Again, reducing it to the 1/90th model size I have. I don't know if you can even see this. I think yes, here may be better. In the 1/90th size model, so multiply this by 90 times and you'll get the size. It's about the size of a full-grown man. This was not a small lamp. It was actually a series of lamps, 7 of them at the top. Again, the number 7 begins to prop up in this sanctuary. Now, they had a cup at the top that was filled with olive oil, and then a wick was placed in it and then lit. Now, that wick would only last about 12 hours, and so they had to change the wick and refill the oil every 12 hours. So this was done every morning and every evening. It's almost like the final duty of the priest who worked for that day. There was one more little thing. Sorry, it's not on the slide. There was a little altar. It's multiply this by 90 and you get the size. So it's a small altar. It's known by different names, altar of incense, but most often simply as the golden altar. And this is where the priest would actually burn incense at the top of the altar. And that incense would rise up into the Holy of Holies. When we enter the Holy of Holies, we meet the Ark of the Covenant, the most precious, the most powerful, the most energy-filled structure of the temple. Now, I have here, this is not from that scale model I have. This is a different scale. The Ark of the Covenant is basically a box that's fully gold-plated, acacia wood. I used to think when I was a kid that 2 priests could carry this. No, the weight was so much that you would need about 10 priests to carry it. Now, the top part is the cover, which is actually removable, as you will notice, like this model. Now, this part had angels molded at the top, as well as the thing is pure gold. It's about 10, 15 centimeters thick. Imagine the amount of gold and the weight of this cover. In Hebrew, it's called kaporet, and it is shaped a little bit like a throne. And so the rabbis tell us that there was a light, an artificial light that hung over the ark. The Bible does not. They call it Shekinah, and most Adventists know about the Shekinah. What is important about this, other than being a box, is what was placed inside. 3 items. The covenant tablets. This is not the tablet of the 10 Commandments, by the way. It's the document of the covenant, okay, full thing, representing God's rulership. And then a pot of manna. Okay, these are all small little items representing God's providence. And then the rod of Aaron, representing God's leadership. Okay, these 3 items were in that ark. So the covenant tablets, the manna pot, and Aaron's staff. Here's something else. How did that manna remain unspoiled inside the ark for all of their history. As far as we know, it was never removed from that. They could not touch it. Again, another mystery. What was the length of Aaron's rod? Well, this box is not very large. It's about the size of most office tables these days. So did they have to cut Aaron's rod into half, or was it a shorter staff? We don't know. The third mystery is the covenant tablets. Most Adventists think the Ten Commandments are written here. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says that the book of the covenant was recorded here. And it also tells us that it was written on all surfaces, front and back, and probably even the side, because it would have been fairly thick. I believe that what you find in that is a documentation of the covenant God made with Israel. The Ten Commandments are part of that, the 10 words, but there's a lot more. There's description about altar, there's description of some basic relational issues making up the covenant, God's promises of his terms in that covenant, as well as Israel's commitment to the covenant. Now remember, it took Moses nearly 40 days to write this covenant unto this stone, second time around, because the first time God wrote, and then Moses broke all of them, and they had to be redone. And so clearly there was a lot more in there than we realize. And maybe this is one of the reasons why religious fortune hunters have been hunting the ark to this day. We really want to see what's actually inside, to see did it have the potency, does it still have the potency of energy that it had at the time of Moses. You remember how the Philistines were defeated because of this box, and the foolishness of Israel thinking that the box was like a magic box, they carry it to battle, they would win any battle, and the carelessness of people in moving the ark resulted in the death of one of David's soldiers. So both the Philistines, Israel's number one enemy, and Israel understood this ark as extremely filled with destructive energy. At least that's the way they saw it. What many of us don't realize, because we don't always read the Bible carefully, whenever they travel, that's another reason why they probably did not travel so much, and they had to move this ark. Before the priests or Levites who were appointed to carry it could come and touch, the functioning priests for that day would have to go in, and they would have to wrap this up in 7 layers of insulation. That's how much energy they saw being attached to the ark. 7 layers of insulation. We don't know, there is no spelling out of what the 7 layers are. But basically, they had to insulate it and probably pin down the sides so that the energy does not leak out. Think of it like the way we wrap a parcel that has something fragile on the inside. You know, the bubble wrap stuff that we have today. I don't know what they use. Probably combination of cloth and leather and so on. Then only would they be allowed to touch it and to carry it. Now, how much work would it take to do something like that at the risk of their lives every time they set out and every time they reset themselves? Okay, so the Israelites probably didn't move very much. We know that the tabernacle was moved 3 times from the time they entered the land until Solomon built the temple, or until David moved the ark to Jerusalem. So clearly in some 300 years of history, they moved it about 3 times. They were smart enough to realize the potency of what they were given. During the normal day, whether you're looking at the altar outside, the wash basin, or what's happening in the holy place, it's just the normal priests, what we call the ordinary priests. They function on the outer court as well as in the holy place. They were always washing up their hands and feet. And this is another mystery. How can they keep clean when this is all sand floor and there are sandstorms in the desert and they're washing all the time? Do you know what it's like? Another reason why it's probably not an open tank like this, but rather a faucet. If it was an open tank like this, the water would be so muddied with all these hands. Every time they sacrifice, every time they prepare to go into the ark, to go into the holy place, into the tabernacle. As I said earlier, the bread was changed once a week, but the incense and the menorah, these were tackled every morning and every evening. So the priests who functioned that day would burn incense in the morning and then come back in the evening and burn them again. The priests attached to this would change the wick, refill the oil in the morning and then in the evening. The ones who were responsible for the bread, not only did they get to change it only once a week, so that's not a lot of work, but they also get to eat it. There are Sabbath-keeping Christians who believe that the best day for fasting is Shabbat. Now, these are people who never understood the sanctuary. Because the one thing the priest could not do on Shabbat is fast. This was against the religious instructions, the rituals of the tabernacle. That's when they had to do the eating. And so the idea of mixing Sabbath with fasting is really not a very biblical idea. We know when it appeared in Jewish history and Christian history, but you also need to know that Jews do not fast on the Sabbath. They do their fasting in weekdays. Now, Sabbath-keeping Christians think it's a good time to fast on the Sabbath since they're not really working or doing anything. And if they feel a little weak or tired from the loss of energy, the loss of calories in their bodies, that's okay because it's only Shabbat, which defeats the entire purpose of Shabbat, because Shabbat is not to stop the necessities of life, but rather to stop the work of life. The high priest, this was the glory guy. There are two different depictions here, but I'll try to explain to you. His clothing. Inside, he wears a plain white robe, just like the normal priest. But above that, he wore a short kind of a skirt robe that was blue in color. But this robe was special. It had bells and pomegranate fixtures at the bottom. I think this picture shows them better, pomegranate and bells. And whenever the priest or the high priest move around, everybody could hear. This is like how people in India, especially Hindus, tie a bell to a cow, and wherever the cow goes, they can hear the bell and they know that's a holy thing moving around. Ancient Israel would know the presence of the high priest. They could hear the sound. So if the high priest was on duty and he was moving around, they would hear him, even if they could not actually see him. Now, above the blue robe is a kind of a half coat that hangs front and back, called an ephod. It's embroidered with pictures of nature and angels. And then he has a golden sash or belt. All of this reappear in Revelation, by the way, that he wears. And then he has what we call the breastplate. It's basically just a leather pouch with 12 precious stones. What's interesting about these stones, when you compare the name list, they are the same stones that Ezekiel records with the creation of the earth. They are the same stones with the foundation of the New Jerusalem. And the number 12 clearly was told to Moses that it represented a different tribe of Israel. So whenever the high priest came into the sanctuary, he was carrying the nation on his chest. But the high priest also had two special stones. Some people believe they were mounted on his shoulders. Some believe they had special pockets inside his ephod. One was called the Urim, one was called the Thummim. These were the high priest's mobile phone. So if he had a question of God, he'd go into the sanctuary and he'd ask God that question. And if the Urim, which was on the right, lights up, that means God is saying yes. Of course, it was like a yes and no kind of question. If the Thummim, which was on the left, glows, then the answer from God is no. So, for example, if the high priest comes into the presence of God and says, God, we need to fight our enemies. Should we go to war against the Philistines? If that glows. So this was the first telecommunication system in the Bible. God actually talking to people through remote control or a remote gadget. Now remember, the prophets had a different communication with God. God actually spoke into their minds. But the high priest had these two stones. And these stones tell us a lot about the work of the high priest. It was not just decorative, like, say, the president of Singapore, who is president but really has no powers, or some other countries have similar systems, same with Israel and so on. But he functions primarily in the Holy of Holies. Yes, I think that he would supervise the worship of Israel on a day-to-day basis. But the only time that he actually worked was in the Holy of Holies. One day, 1 year, one place. Now, I don't know if Pastor Ho would like this job. 1 day, one place in 1 year. I don't know how many of you there sitting there would like this job. However, there is a catch. If the high priest went the wrong day into that Holy of Holies, he would instantly die. In fact, any priest who comes into the tent and is not properly prepared for it, ritually prepared for it, they would die. And so Leviticus records the death of 2 of Aaron's sons. And here's the sad thing about being priest. If a member of your family dies, you cannot go anywhere near the dead body. Simple lesson of the tabernacle, you cannot mix holy and unholy. You'll see more of that in the 4th session. That mixture is impossible. And so Aaron was told that he could not cry, he could not shed tears, he could not attend the funeral, he could not go near the body of his 2 dead sons, who were priests, but went in there with unauthorized fire, and whatever that means, and got themselves killed. Now, for a very long period of my life, I believed, because that's what I was taught, that the pattern Moses was given is a structural pattern. By that, I mean it's an architectural pattern. It had to do with the physical structure. But this is ignoring information in Numbers. When we get to Numbers 2, we discover that the pattern was not simply about that tent itself. It's about how life must be organized around the tent. So it was an organizational, not just a structural pattern. And this is the organizational structure. The tent, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, right in the middle. And then right next to it, in front, were the priests and their families and Moses. And then around it were the 3 clans of Levites. So the Merarites, the Gershonites, and the Kohathites. There were only 3 clans in Israel, all the Levites, which means that this tent, first of all, had a fence all around it. So you could not enter the fence except through one entrance point. And then it had a second ring of protection, the Levites and then the priests themselves. And then the tribes were organized in groups of 3 tribes here, 3 tribes here, 3 here, 3 here. This is east, north, south, and west. And in each of these grouping, a leading tribe was assigned. So Judah was the leading tribe, Dan was the leading tribe, Ephraim was the leading tribe, and Reuben was the leading tribe. When I first came to realize that this tabnith, this pattern God gave Israel, was about the organization of the camp, not just the structure of the tent. It gave me new eyes to the book of Revelation because we see a similar pattern of life organized around the throne of God in the book of Revelation as well. But we shall have a look at that a little bit later. Now, the implication that was given to Moses was this, that all space within this red line, that means the entire camp of Israel, the Levites, the priests, the tent itself, these were all considered holy space. So this entire thing is holy space. And holy persons live in holy space. And you will see the New Testament simply amplifies this to incorporate the whole world as the holy space of God. However, it also taught Israel that there are varying degrees of holiness. So out here in the camp, that's the lightest degree of holiness. Holy of Holies, that's the heaviest degree of holiness. So as you go inwards, you meet increasing degrees of holiness until you reach the Holy of Holies. And by the same token, starting from the Holy of Holies, you move outwards, the spaces become less holy, the people become less holy until you meet the lightest element. So all Israel was holy, but not as holy as the priests and Levites. This space was holy, this was a little bit more holy, but not as holy as the court, and yet that was still open enough for everyone. This was too holy for everyone, so only the priests and the Levites sometimes could enter. This one, way too holy, and so only the high priest could ever go in there. And so the tabnith, the structure, was intended to convey this concept. All space under God is holy, but within that space there are varying degrees of holiness, God himself being the holiest of all. Briefly, through the other models, Solomon's temple. Here's the intriguing thing. When David gave instructions to Solomon to build the temple, he told Solomon that you must build it according to the tabnith that God gave me. Same language as in Exodus, but there were major differences with Moses' tabernacle. For one thing, size. Moses' tabernacle was big, but it was really small compared to Solomon's temple. There were multiple furnishings. The only ones that were not multiple furnishings were the Ark of the Covenant and the altar for sacrifice. And there were unique features in Solomon's temple that were not part of the original tabernacle. Keep this in mind. Both David and Moses were told to build according to tabnith. So did David see a different tabnith than the one Moses saw? Well, no, because the three-part structure of this temple, called the first temple, is the same. There's the outer court, there is the holy place, and there's the most holy place. But notice what Solomon did. He built extra rooms, storage rooms all around it. He had 2 pillars that he built. He even named them. He had this gigantic tank that was so big, it was called the sea. And then he had smaller tanks all along the sides. So it was quite different. He had 10 menorahs, 10 tables. We don't know how many of the incense he had. There were steps in here. The doors were wooden. The walls were marble, stone. Solomon's temple was a solid, immovable structure. Moses' tabernacle was portable. It was a tent. Later on, this temple was destroyed. It was rebuilt and then enlarged and added upon by Herod. And this was the temple that Jesus saw, Jesus and the disciples. It's known to us as Herod's temple, and this is considered the Second Temple period. When the Romans destroyed this temple, it was never rebuilt. One of the great controversies in the Jewish world or Israel's world today is the desire of some Christian groups and some Jewish groups to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. Unfortunately, there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, Muslim shrines, on that same Temple Mount. And if any attempt is made to build a temple there, it would involve destroying those shrines, and that would lead to a third world war for sure. And this is why some Christians believe that's exactly what will precipitate the second coming of Jesus. So it still comes back to this temple in some ways. Ezekiel also saw a temple. About 1/3 of his book is about this temple. It also had unique features. Talked about river and trees lining its banks. This is more like the New Jerusalem. It talks about trees that bear fruit, different fruit monthly, again in Revelation. It talks about 12 gates with the names of 12 tribes. Well, by the time of Herod, there were multiple gates around the temple. I'm not sure there were 12, but multiple gates. But in the tabernacle, there was just one entrance point. Now, as far as we know, this prediction of Ezekiel was never completed. But the features that reappear in Revelation tells us that maybe it's completely proleptic or eschatological. It was not meant to be rebuilt. But it also had the three-part structure. There was the open space out here, there was the bigger room here, and then the inner sanctum over here. The one common feature of these models is that the inner sanctum is a cube. So the Holy of Holies is a cube. And the only other cube, geometric cube in the Bible is the New Jerusalem in Revelation. But we shall deal with that later. What we also see in Ezekiel, similar to Moses in the book of Numbers, is an arrangement of life, more or less around the temple. So here is the temple in the middle. Priests and Levites live around it. The citizens who live in the city, that's a different structure here. The prince and his household, and we are not told who the prince is, would live here. And then outside that would be the tribal lands. So it's a very similar structure to what we find in Numbers. So clearly, Tabnith, the sanctuary, the tabernacle, is more than just that tent or that temple. You know that after Solomon built the Temple of Jerusalem, the entire life and history of that nation and its religion became completely centered on that temple. And when that temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews in exile thought that the covenant itself had been taken away from them. That is what the impact of these things really mean on them. Okay, so what have we seen? There are multiple models, three main ones about the sanctuary, but all of them share the same three-part structure. So there's something about the number 3 and then the number 7 that appear over and over in these structures. And then this, all space and time around is holy. And so Israel is holy because they were in holy place. And later on, we will see that even time in relationship to this sanctuary is holy. Of course, some Sabbath keepers think that time is holy only on Shabbat. That is not what the sanctuary teaches. Human life has two governing parameters, time and space. And the presence of God makes both time and space holy. And therefore, the tabernacle was intended to show that everything God touches, that you can see with your eyes in how it works in that model, all of that is holy. So the people, the time, and so on.